Lindiwe grew up in the landlocked kingdom of Swaziland. She was privileged to be able to afford an exceptional education and went on to study veterinary medicine at the University of Pretoria. After graduating, Lindiwe worked at a couple of veterinary clinics in South Africa before returning to Swaziland. She specialized in wildlife, and no 2 days were the same. Typically, she conducted routine checks inside the various reserves and game parks, and sometimes she was called on to help with big projects in the nearby Kruger National Park. But one incident she was called to, she never forgot. She was a regular visitor to Makaya Game Reserve. It was a small park in Swaziland, but was home to the critically endangered black rhino. When Lindiwe's phone sprung into life, one of the rangers on the other end was clearly distressed. She made her way to Makaya, heading off the highway before crossing the river into the reserve. Once there, she met up with the team of rangers and learned that one of the black rhinos had been caught in a snare. It had been set by poachers, but they were after smaller game to feed their families or sell on the black market. It hadn't been intended to catch such a large animal. Even so, the snare had tightened around the rhino's foot and was now clearly causing the animal some trouble. Lindiwe hopped into the Land Rover with the rangers, and they raced to the rhino's last known position. It was difficult to spot the wildlife. The terrain was rough and rugged. It was full of thick bushes and thorny thickets, concealing the animals. But the rangers were experts at their jobs. They were able to track down the rhino, which had moved from where they had last seen it. They left the vehicle and followed a promising set of footprints. Some fresh dung confirmed that they were on the right trail. Then, when they rounded a dense patch of foliage, they came face to face with the rhino. Lindiwe could see straight away that the rhino was in pain. She wasn't bearing any weight on her back right foot, and there was an obvious swelling above the wire. The rhino turned to look at them. They stood stock still. The rhino raised its head slightly. She was smelling them, and Lindiwe held her breath. They were in a dangerous position with the vehicle too far to run to in case of a charge. But despite the rhino clearly seeing them, it didn't run at them. It seemed to be taking them in, observing them cautiously. Lindiwe lifted her darting rifle to her shoulder and stared down the sights. She fired the dart, and it struck the rhino directly in the backside. The rhino lurched and kicked out before trotting off into the bushes. The team backed off to give the anesthetic time to kick in. When the rhino slumped to the ground, they raced to begin treatment. They only had half an hour before the anesthetic wore off and the rhino would begin to stir. Then they would have to get out of there as quickly as possible. Lindiwe immediately assessed the rhino's foot. It looked as though the snare had been on for a good few days. The wire cut deep into the skin and the red flesh beneath. Yellow pus oozed from the wound, and an unpleasant smell told them that it was infected. In the heat of the African sun, it wouldn't take long for an infection like this to spread throughout the body, and then it would be almost impossible to come back from. Lindiwe took out some sharp wire cutters and began to cut the wire out of the rhino's foot. The swelling meant that the metal was almost completely consumed inside the bulging flesh, but the team were able to unwrap the snare and eventually the foot was free. That was only half the battle, though. Now, Lindiwe cleaned the wound as best she could. She treated it with antiseptic spray and gave the rhino an injection of long-lasting antibiotics to stave off any infection. She also administered a painkiller. Then it was time to stand back and let the rhino come round. Slowly, the rhino began to stir, and then a few minutes later she lifted her head and looked around. She stared directly at Lindiwe and the team who were standing at some distance away. The rhino rolled onto her front and then staggered to her feet. She stood dazed for a few moments before nonchalantly wandering off behind the bushes. Lindiwe's job was done, but she wasn't sure how well the rhino would respond to the treatment. It could already have been too late. The team returned to the ranger station. Lindiwe had a small office there. It was where she kept some supplies and treated small animals when necessary. She filled out some paperwork and left Makaya Game Reserve. Over the next few years, Lindiwe visited the reserve on other calls. She always kept an eye out for the black rhino, and although the rangers told her that the rhino was doing well, Lindiwe didn't see her until one day. 6 years had passed since Lindiwe had treated the black rhino. She was at Makaya once more. This time she was in the office sorting out paperwork when she heard a loud snort outside the open door. She got up from her desk and peered cautiously outside. There, standing just yards away, was a black rhino. Lindiwe froze. She knew how dangerous it was to be cornered by one of the most powerful beasts in Africa. The rhino was looking directly at Lindiwe. Contrary to popular belief, rhinos actually have relatively good eyesight. It would be able to see Lindiwe clearly. The vet didn't know what it was doing there, so she just stood in the doorway staring back at it for a while. Then the rhino shifted uneasily on its feet, and that's when Lindiwe noticed its leg. There was an obvious bulge forming a circle around the back right leg. This was the same rhino that Lindiwe had treated all those years ago. Lindiwe couldn't believe her eyes. All this time she had been keeping a lookout for the rhino whilst doing her rounds, and she had never seen her. But it wasn't long before Lindiwe realized something was wrong. The rhino took a few paces towards her. She was shuffling on her feet again, just like she had done so before. Lindiwe wanted to get closer, but she didn't trust the one-ton animal with its half-a-meter-long horn and ability to squash her flat in one swift movement. The rhino was clearly agitated and walked around in a circle. When Lindiwe did step out from the doorway, she could see something glistening on the rhino's side. The afternoon sun was highlighting a long, deep gash carved into the rhino's skin. The blood that had oozed from the wound had formed a dry crust that ran down the rhino's skin. The rhino brought her back leg up to try and kick or scratch the gash. It was obviously bothering her. Had the rhino come looking for help, or was this merely a coincidence? They have incredible smell, so had she detected Lindiwe and remembered what had happened before? There was no way of telling. Lindiwe didn't know what to do. She had the dart gun in her office, and she had the antibiotics, antiseptic spray and painkillers with her. But she needed clearance to perform this kind of work. She radioed through to the rangers, and they arrived a few minutes later. Lindiwe explained the situation, but the rhino was getting more anxious with the arrival of more people. They considered bringing in a cattle crush to hold the rhino still whilst it received treatment, but there was no way they would be able to coax the enormous beast into something like that. In the end, Lindiwe and the rangers made the decision to anesthetize the rhino and treat her whilst on the ground. They fired the dart into her once more, and minutes later the rhino stumbled down. Lindiwe rushed over to her, first prodding her with a stick to make sure she was out. But the rhino had fallen onto the side with the wound on it. The team had to work quickly to turn her over using some ratchet straps and their Land Rover. Then Lindiwe got to work. When the rhino came around, the team stood back. They watched as she got to her feet and calmly walked off without a second glance back at Lindiwe or the rangers. They couldn't believe that the rhino had seemingly deliberately visited them again, asking for help. But when Lindiwe looked into this extraordinary behavior, she found that there had been other occasions from all across southern Africa where injured rhinos had made their way to ranger stations, apparently seeking help. Whatever the reason for the rhino's encounter with Lindiwe the second time, Lindiwe was just happy that she had met the rhino she had treated all those years ago and was able to do the same once more.